Welcome to Unbox Your World, the podcast where philosophy meets tech. In each episode, we're connecting the dots between philosophy, technology, society, science, and progressive thought. And together with brilliant minds across the world who dare to challenge the way we think and live in today's society, we are unboxing our minds one episode at a time. I am Maria Salting. I am a tech professional during the day and a philosopher at night. So let's get started. Let's unbox ourselves. What if there was a simple way to explain why people can have such different worldviews? What if there was a simple way to understand why some countries care more about solving climate change than others do? What if there was an easy way to understand polarization and create a win-win-win to instead unite people? Now, spiral dynamics offers a simple framework to understand human development and how humanity's values change over time and how they are expressed in different sequential stages. This model can be applied both at an individual level and on a cultural level. And in the model, each stage has its own pros and cons, and spiral dynamics offer a way to understand and honor how people can have varying opinions on reality. Thanks to this tool, we can then create a win-win-win situation to, in fact, unite people instead of fueling polarization. Now, this is what Nomali Pereira does professionally as an executive coach and a facilitator, where she is applying the theory of spiral dynamics and other development tools to help teams and individuals to perform at their highest capability. Now, in this episode, although Nomali specifically presents the stages in a very simple way, the actual study of spiral dynamics is complex and does take time. So, with everything else, spiral dynamics is in fact a tool and should be treated as such. So it should be used wisely and most importantly with humility. Now, let's get started and tune into the show today to learn more about spiral dynamics. Hello, Nomali Pereira. Welcome to Unbox Your World. Super happy to have you here.
Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you for welcoming me into your show, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, likewise. It's so we're going to talk about today something called spiral dynamics, and that is actually how I found it was I was at a conference about regenerative finance, so how you can rethink the future financial system in a way that is more in tune with the environment as well. And someone just like, oh, have you heard of spiral dynamics? And then I thought that was a beautiful way to kind of explain the dynamics in the world, why some people, for example, care about the climate and while some nations do not the same way. So that's why I wanted to find someone who could talk about spiral dynamics, and that's what you do professionally. So just to start off, would you like to explain the concept of spiral dynamics and what it is and how it can be used and the different stages?
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of information about it. If I'm talking too much about the sort of the context to spiral dynamics, you can always jump in and stop me. But yeah, very simply put, spiral dynamics is a theory or a model that is attempting to show the different value systems and the worldviews through which individuals, but also organizations or societies could be evolving. So it's a human development model, I would say, and it's specifically looking at values. How do we grow through our values, and how all of us through these different stages have different value systems, and that causes us to develop or have different worldviews. We're looking at the world through different lenses. So that's what it's really looking at. I think as we speak about stages of development, it's always really helpful to look at the idea of lines of development. So, for example, there's a philosopher called Ken Wilber, and I'm actually very much more in the sort of the meta theory world, in which it has room for stages of development. And Ken Wilber speaks about different lines of development, or, for example, the Howard Gardner, I believe, is one of the theorists who introduced the idea that we evolve in different areas of development. It's not just that we just develop and evolve and grow in one way. And so, for example, the French researcher Jean Piaget researched the idea of cognitive development, asking this question of what am I aware of? And then several people like Suzanne Kugreuter, Jane Lovinger, Erik Erikson, they researched the idea of ego development or self-development. And then in this idea of, as an individual, what am I, who am I? Who am I? Daniel Goleman is a researcher that looked at the idea of emotional development, emotional intelligence development, and he would research around the question of how do I feel about this? James Fowler is a researcher who looked at what is spiritual development? What is of ultimate concern? So in that way, different people have different researchers, theorists have looked at different areas of development. Abraham Maslow, the famous hierarchy of needs, right? Kohlberg looked at moral development. What should I do? What's the right thing to do? And in that way, what a gentleman by the name of Clare Graves, who was a student and a professor of Union College in New York in the US, what he was looking at was, what is significant to me? And this kind of ended up being the area of values. What do I value? And he was a student at a place called Union College during the Second World War. And a lot of the teachers in his university were actually going off to the war. And so what the college did was that they would bring in, because they didn't have one teacher to teach psychology, the school would bring in different teachers to offer different teachings. And he himself would later encounter the question, which is, well, what is the right theory then of who is a mature psychologically mature human being? And so when he was a professor, he actually started to offer that question to his students. And his students were a broad range of ages, a broad range of, both the genders, and also a lot of people of different ages who were now returning from the war. And he would ask this question of, who do you think is a mature psychologically mature human being? And he didn't know what answers he would receive from that. And so the history of spiral dynamics really begins with him posing this question to his students. And from what I have heard, that almost throughout a period of about 12 years, he did this research. Having people answer this question. And I don't want to get too much into his research methodologies, but he didn't have a predetermined answer to that. So that is what's really cool, in the sense that he was also learning from what his students were responding to this question. Eventually, what happened was that he started to sort of create different categories, different piles of papers, for example, that these students were writing. And he started noticing patterns that different students were responding. And then he was able to categorize them. And he saw, very first of all, something that he saw was that some people were expressing this answer to who do I think a psychologically mature human being is that they were expressing their self. expressing self, and then others that were sort of sacrificing self. And he saw that every category was going from expressing self to sacrifice self, but it would go from I want to express myself regardless of what others have to say. But then there were a little bit more complexity that was added to that, in the sense of I want to express myself, but not at the expense of what others have to say. So he would see that there was a little bit more complexity, and that was driven into this idea of expressing oneself. In the same way, similarly, in how some people would sacrifice themselves, it would be that I would sacrifice myself no matter what. But others would say I would sacrifice my views to include others' views in such a way, but also be able to honor and value my own views. That's what perhaps a mature psychological human being would do. So he would begin to see these different ways in which what he then eventually would say is that our values are being expressed in these different ways. And starting from a more kind of an earlier level of development, which could be a little bit more egocentric, for example, we develop through a sequence of stages that ends up becoming more and more complex, more and more allowing, and eventually more and more allowing of the entire spiral of development. So he actually called it the emergent cyclical theory. He didn't call it spiral dynamics.
Okay.
Spiral dynamics is a term that the emergent cyclical theory was given by people like Don Beck and Christopher Cohen, who were his students, who actually continued his work, further developed his work after he died in 1986. So, and right now, Dr. Don Beck, whose work I'm very familiar with, and I've been, I trained under him as well, took many of his trainings. Now he's dead as well. But so that's just a little bit of how this human development model of exploring values and the fact that they are developing through sequential stages, that's what is called spiral dynamics.
So spiral dynamics is basically a model to understand human development, right? And yet you have to go through these different stages, but you cannot skip one, right? You have to go through all of them. So what are those stages? Where does it start and where does it end?
Yeah. So this is, typically these kinds of conversations about these stages have to be done very carefully and very thoughtfully because they are complex. And I want to just say also that typically you'd need 50 hours at the minimum to really understand the nuances of each stage. And sometimes when we don't take time to understand them with their nuances, it can also be dangerous because people can really misuse these kinds of ideas and use them in very manipulative ways if you're not aware. So I want to say that right off the bat. But that said, I think just to give a very simple, quick idea of the stages, I would say that we all begin, sort of humanity in a way begins at the stage of what is referred to as beige, or the archaic stage. So very, super quickly, beige is kind of, it's like where we all begin and where we all end. It's the stage at which basic survival is of most importance. It's about food. It's about water and warmth and sex and sort of living off basic safety. This is where, if you think of sort of the primordial or sort of the primitive brain, where we respond with sort of that flight, fight, freeze kind of responses, that's where beige really responds to the world as. There's no distinct sense of a self at beige. You're sort of living off the land, almost like animals in a sense, and that's where it primarily begins, and it has a sort of an age range of, some would say that, as humanity begins, beige, this archaic stage, has been around for 250,000 years. So it's a very old and very sort of an established stage of development. Where we find it now is that, you'd actually find it in newborn infants, as well as the sort of the senile elderly. When we lose consciousness, we don't have a sense of self. That's a sort of this archaic stage. And by the way, I also just want to mention, I'll be using these colors. Clare Graves didn't give his stages, his emergent cyclical theory, any colors. It's Don Beck and Christopher Cohen that really gave colors to these stages, only really to make it simpler to communicate.
Yeah.
The colors don't really have any meaning in and of itself. So yeah, you can also see the stage beige. Like if a bomb exploded right outside my house, I'm going to go right down to beige.
Yeah.
All I'm really going to want to do is to save myself. I'm not going to be having any philosophical thoughts and, analysis about why did this bomb explode, So it's energetically, we all will fall into this beige stage, and rightfully we have to sometimes in order to create survival. So
I guess it would be dangerous even if that didn't happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying there is really another lesson to remember about spiral dynamics or any stage theory, really, is that these early stages of development have incredible gifts to offer. And the wrong way of understanding stages of development is this idea that we denigrate or that we diminish the value of these early stages. They're incredibly valuable, and we need to be able to, in a healthy way, integrate the gifts of the early stages. Otherwise, they remain in what's called shadow, like the Carl Jungian idea of shadow. So beige, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who are in war zones right now as we speak.
Yeah.
Russia, Ukraine, for example, but lots of other places in this world where there's a lot of struggle. And in those kinds of zones, but also people who are in addiction, in the Western world or anywhere, people who are in an addicted state of mind are perhaps really, walking the streets of Vancouver in British Columbia or San Francisco, looking for that next fix. That's a very kind of sort of the very desperate state of beige that we can find ourselves in. And typically, the way that stages develop, how one would go from one stage to another, is not known entirely why we evolve through these stages. Some would say, though, that we come to a crisis, like we hit a wall. That stage doesn't fulfill our needs anymore. And so in that way, you can imagine the hunter-gatherer stage is very individual in a sense. So you're just kind of looking out for yourself. You learn that actually if I band together with a few others, I might be safer. And that idea that I might actually find more security, and that idea leads perhaps to the next stage, which is the purple stage. And that could be called the magical, or even the use of the word tribal used carefully, is the purple stage, where I'm not alone anymore. I actually have a small group or a small clan or a small tribe to which I belong, and I'm more secure here. And at this stage, which one would say really began roughly around 50,000 years ago, is where we feel that life is really deeply connected to the earth and nature, and the earth is sacred. We experience the world as enchanted. There's an enchantment of spirit and sort of sacred objects and rituals and rites of passage. There's still no strong sense of self yet. In other words, the ego hasn't really developed yet at this stage. And there's a deep respect in a tribe for ancestral wisdom, for example, indigenous wisdom. Lineage is very important at this stage. At this stage, it's very self-sacrificing. You don't have a sense of self very much, and you sacrifice your sense of individuality to the well-being of the group. It's very, very sort of tribe or clan focused. In fact, in human civilization, the future stages that are yet to emerge will eventually be very cruel to this stage, with things like colonization that will come through later stages. Yeah, this stage is highly abused. You can see that in the way for example, in Canada, there's a lot of controversy around how colonizers really abused and exploited the native populations of that country hundreds of years ago. So this isn't necessarily, or less than hundreds of years ago even, this isn't necessarily to say that indigenous populations today are purple. Purple is really mostly uncontacted tribes that you can find in many parts of the world, in African tribes, perhaps in the Amazon, in sort of in Native American spaces. There's a lot of beautiful connection to that, and really honoring the sacredness of the world. In children, this is where, like, I remember when I was a child, if my dad was driving the car and I would look outside and I'd see the moon, and I would feel like the moon is following me. Oh, we're driving somewhere and the moon is like coming with us. That's how the little childhood mind has a magical way of responding to the world. If they put on a Superman cape, the child feels like, oh, now I'm Superman, so that beautiful magical belief system is in this purple stage. And again, at some point, I think some members of a purple tribe, for example, you could just imagine, maybe some of those members would feel like, I'm kind of tired of this little smallness of our life. There's a whole world out there, perhaps, where I matter. Like, I don't want to be so merged in this little community. I'm bigger than that. And that's really the emergence of the next stage, which is the red stage. And this is the first sense of an identity forming, a first sense of an ego forming. So in sort of human life, it begins around age 2, like little 2-year-old kids that begin to throw a tantrum because they feel like, hey, I'm powerful here. Like, I'm not merged at the hip with my mother and father here, so I have my toys and I need that food, or, and that's really a beautiful stage where the human ego is really coming alive. And civilization begins to show signs of this probably around 15 to 20,000 years ago, where individuals are becoming powerful. I'm not a part of the tribe anymore. I'm separate from the tribe. I have my own views. And typically it emerges as a sort of a confidence in oneself, and it's advocating strongly for what you want. It's powerful, it's impulsive, it's very egocentric. This is a very self-focused, ego-focused stage. Again, not that it's bad. For this stage, it's good that one can look out for oneself. Through civilization, you can see sort of the Romans kind of conquering, dominating, intimidating. It demands obedience, and it demands labor. And so that's where actually colonization could begin. You want to sort of expand how far you can go and how much you can power over. It's sort of the basis for feudal empires, power and glory. It's self-indulgent without any shame or guilt. You want instant gratification. So this is the red stage, and you can see that today in sort of rebellious youth, feudal kingdoms, in war situations, in even sort of in the new kind of cancel culture. In the old times, red would just put a gun to your head, or pull out a sword and chop your head off and cancel you in that way. But in these sort of current postmodern times, you'll be canceled, and if you say the wrong thing, or and so that's a new form of cancellation, which is a sort of a red way of behaving in the world. You see that in sort of this world of sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's a very indulgent world. It's delicious. It's very sexually alive, and things like that. But it can also be that sense of egocentric nature of it is eventually giving rise to the next stage, which kind of comes out of each new stage, arrives with some emergent new properties to kind of civilize the madness of the previous stage, or the inadequacies of the previous stage. So the blue stage comes next, as a very sort of a conservative, religious, very orderly state that comes to discipline and civilize the red stage, which can, left to its own devices, can become very aggressive and sort of leave a trail of blood and dead bodies. So the blue stage is referred to as the traditional stage. It's also very group-centric. So instead of egocentric, it's group-centric, which can also be called as ethnocentric. There's a powerful sense of family and community. It's very focusing on discipline and order. Life has meaning and purpose, and with outcomes that are determined sometimes by an almighty God, or it's a lot of sort of belief in a higher authority. That sense of the ego is controlled by a higher authority. So I am sacrificing myself. Red is expressing self. Blue is sacrificing self. And it can also feel very rigid, and it has a lot of moral codes of right and wrong. And if you're rewarded for following the rules, and you're punished for breaking the rules. Strong sense of social hierarchy, very sort of paternalistic. Impulsivity of red is controlled through guilt, punishment in that way.
Yeah.
So that group focus is good, but the pathology of it is that if you extend it too far, then you begin to believe at blue that only my kind is good. All other, so if I'm a Christian, then only Christians are good, and all other religions are bad, or they're traitors, or only my community or my school is good. So you see these kind of a lot of me and othering, or us versus them. That happens a lot at this, and this is a very, very, very highly established old stage of development. 5,000 years ago, like with the Renaissance, for example, from a civilization historical perspective, where really sort of belief systems are strong. It's like, if you should believe me if I say so, because I'm more of an authority than you are, or you should believe God because the Bible says so. That kind of idea. It's more subjective. This belief systems are more subjective. There isn't a lot of objectivity in this stage. You can see that today in social conservatism, in sort of codes of honor, religious fundamentalism. Religiosity isn't necessarily bad, but when it becomes fundamentalist, that's where the problems begin. You can see this in colonialism, in sort of, like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, where you're really taught a lot of rules, and the moral majority, patriotism. So again, I think, at least in the United States, it's believed that about 30% of the population are at this blue stage. And the blue stage also hits a wall. And that's how the next stage, the orange stage, comes through, is really from when, 300-400 years ago, especially in Europe, when the sort of the scientists are emerging. The world is not flat, the world is round. And for being, brave to make such propositions meant that you could be killed historically to make these sort of
Yeah.
the emergence of science, right? And so orange comes up, and of course, people like Rene Descartes begins to really claim that separation of mind and body. And so everything becomes a little bit more objectivist here. And the subjective world of the previous stages are put to the test here. So the self is now escaping from what could become like a herd mentality of blue, that strict conformity doesn't work anymore for orange. Orange wants to now become more self-expressive. Enough of sort of me sacrificing myself for the group. Now, once again, just like red and orange, we're seeking truth in objective, more rational, scientific terms, pragmatic, experimental. I'm willing to take risks. The world is a sort of a well-oiled machine, like Rene Descartes would have said. It's got its natural laws that can be learned and mastered and manipulated, highly achievement-oriented. It's the world of numbers, big data, rules the world. So again, nothing wrong. I mean, it's what gave us technology. It's what gives us medicine, the advancements of the medicine today, which we all need. It's very, it's like the marketplace alliances. And so there's nothing wrong with it until it becomes very manipulative and exploitative. So it'll destroy the environment. And this is what has really, given us problems of climate and climate change and all that. So you can see the ideas of this scientific orange stage, which is world-centric, instead of ethnocentric, it's becoming more world-centric. It's actually able to have a more complex view and include more beyond ethnocentric and beyond egocentric. You'll see this in the stock exchange and the venture capitalist startup world, Silicon Valley, and anywhere really, not just Silicon Valley, but that sort of world that is incredibly exciting in many ways. It's emerging middle classes around the world, big data, the fashion world, the cosmetics industry, the agribusiness, factory farming, which has no sensitivity. That's what's happening, is that orange, left to its own devices, it's so capitalistic, it's so exploitative eventually, that it loses that sense of romance and sensitivity and emotions and the subjective world. And so that's what's eventually, and this scientific rationalistic worldview has been around for about 300 or 400 years, really. And then out of the struggles of that is the green worldview, the postmodern worldview, which again is about 30% of the United States. These are just very sort of general numbers. There's about 30% of blue, 30% of orange, and about 30% of green. And the green worldview comes out of the very destructive exploitation of orange. And so it's all of a sudden now saying, hold on, wait a minute. The objective world of orange tells us that sort of matter, the world of matter, and this objectivist world, the propositional world of orange is what's true. Everything else is like bullshit, And blue, green emerges to say, now, wait a minute, you can't dictate to us what truth is, and that this objective world, materialistic, atomistic world is the only truth. No. Green is, there's a whole world of subjective realities and intersubjective realities of culture that can actually determine what truth is. We can all decide what truth is for us. So it's good for a while until that too runs into trouble. But green in general is very communitarian. It's very egalitarian. It really values feelings and sort of the heart space, and sort of feelings supersede the cold rationality of orange. It's deeply aware of ecological issues. It's deeply seeking sustainability and regeneration, and the human spirit has to be freed from the dogma of blue and the greed of orange, right? And there's a lot of emphasis on relationships, diversity, equity, inclusion, those kinds of topics, because it really sort of sees how much the hierarchical systems and sort of winner take all kind of ways of being in the previous stages have harmed humanity and societies. So, it's really paying attention to diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And the biggest performative contradiction of green, unfortunately, is that it has a hatred for hierarchies. And unfortunately, it fails to see that there are dominator hierarchies and there are growth hierarchies, natural hierarchies. Dominator hierarchies are what sort of blue and orange and red are functioning in. But there are natural hierarchies of just the world as it evolves. Just like, the way organisms comes into being out of like atoms and cells and atoms and molecules and cells. That's a very simple natural hierarchy. So there's a very strong performative contradiction that happens at green, which is to say that they like non-linear thinking, they like non-hierarchical being, which is good, but then green unfortunately can become a little aggressive and arrogant in that belief and imposes its own value system of non-hierarchy on the rest of the world. But that imposition in itself is actually a valuing that they think is better, which in itself is actually a hierarchy. That my way of thinking that hierarchies are wrong actually something
paradox.
It's very paradoxical, and it's an irony that green somehow misses the point about that. So green, it values decision making through consensus, except that consensus is never really found. So like meetings can go on and on and on because you're trying to include everybody's voices as equal. And while that's good, it becomes very disruptive to strategy and just really moving forward. This is also sacrificing self stage. Orange is expressing self, and green is sacrificing self. We see this green everywhere in the Western world, especially, and I think even more than in the US, where you come from, in sort of Europe and Scandinavia, green is really, I think it's a healthier form of green, perhaps, in the Nordic nations, for example, or Europe in general, perhaps.
We have a very consensus-driven way of making decisions in business, at least in the startup world.
Yeah, I mean, this is the world. The good things about green is it's really valuing in our diversity in a certain way. This is where, like, gender pronouns, for example, people wanting to put she, her, hers, or him, or they, and these kind of the different pronouns that are being honored. And so that's a good thing. The bad thing is that green is very impatient and aggressive if you get it wrong. So this is where also what is typically referred to as woke politics, for example, come out of this green stage, where there's a sort of a hyper emphasis on political correctness. So while it tries to be really sensitive, it also becomes very aggressive in a sense. It becomes very punishing in a sense. So green in some ways has a lot of shadow of red and green. Red and blue.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah. It gave us a lot of good things like civil rights and feminism and, animal rights, and all that kind of arises out of green. And then I think the next stage, which is really the beginning of what is called the second tier, is arising out of the pathologies of this postmodern green stage because of its performative contradictions and its hyper emphasis on political correctness and such. That's actually beginning to be very polarizing. And so the next stages, which are referred to as integral stages, so yellow and turquoise, yellow as the early integral stages, it's really coming out of a need to bring a little bit of sanity to the kind of the pathologies of all of the previous stages. And this brings up the topic in spiral dynamics of first year and second tier. First year stages are beige through green, and one of the defining characteristics of these first year stages is that none of them recognizes that other stages or value systems exist. So if a green sees blue, it's typically seen as wrong or kind of stupid even.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way of valuing the gifts of other stages. Orange would see green and they would just sort of mock them as tree huggers or, yoga and, latte liberals, So this is how the first year stages tends to see themselves as the only right way to be. And all others are crazy or stupid or wrong. And the second tier stages, it's said that it's the first time in human evolution that consciousness itself is aware of its own development. And it begins to be able to value the gifts and the struggles of the entire spiral of development and not just see that they're wrong, they're like not enough, or, So first year stages are behaving in a sense of lack and fear. And what's taught about second tier is that we're actually beginning to come more from a place of being and abundance. Doesn't mean that our shadow of the entire spiral is gone. Certainly not. In fact, second tier people have more shadow and struggles because they're actually carrying the struggles of all of the other previous stages in their lives. But yeah, it's like first year comes from a lot of deficiency, and second year comes from a little bit more of a sense of abundance. So I think that's what's important about these levels of development, is that we're going through more and more complexity, but with that complexity also comes a certain simplicity of being able to see the world and see ourselves and become more self-aware and hopefully kinder and more compassionate. Yeah.
So in those last stages, you can more see the like how these different stages are interacting, right? And how you can more understand people more, like why they are behaving and reacting in certain ways, and do that a little bit more compassionately, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, to go back to what I was saying in the beginning about being used to, how different countries care more or less about trying to solve the global climate crisis. I think the discussion that I was having there at the conference, it just makes sense that, I come from a very privileged country with we've had a lot of good development, and we have a lot of people caring about relatively, we have a lot of people caring about actually trying to solve the climate crisis in Sweden. But we also, we are a privileged country. We've gone through all these development stages, and we have very high standards. So why would we expect people that are becoming industrialized to just jump straight to think about climate when they're also trying to get up to speed with standards? So I think maybe it could be argued then that in our development, our more developed countries, that our job is to actually make the technology or the solutions just simple enough so it's easy to just do the right thing. And it's our job not to tell people to care about the climate, but actually make it so simple that it's just better for them to do what's climate friendly.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of a sort of a strategy that where I live in the US, which is called Boulder, Colorado, Boulder, Colorado is one of the greenest, and greenest in the sense of spiral dynamics, green, but also like ecologically aware, in the sense that, it used to be that there was a recycling program throughout the country where you're supposed to separate your recycling, for example. And Boulder, Colorado is one of the first states where let's make it easier for people to recycle by having a single stream recycle process. So paper, glass, don't worry, we'll do the sorting. You just we'll give you the right will give you a bin, and you can just drop all of your paper and glass and plastics all into one bin. So let's make it easier for people. That's a sort of a very nice strategic example, and now over here composting is also required, and so we're given a recycling bin as well as a compost bin. So it's sort of, not that recycling alone is going to help climate change, but it's teaching people to take action that is better for the earth. So a lot of people are composting here, and again, it's not that you have to compost in your own backyard or something. We have a compost bin, so whatever belongs, and a lot of trash is compostable. So there's less landfill and more, and that's another thing. Instead of calling it trash, here we call it landfill, and that word makes you think, oh, this is not, it's we're throwing this into the landfill means we're actually filling the land with this garbage here. So it changes the mindset. I didn't get, I know I took a little time, I took a lot of time there to explain a little bit of all those other stages. I didn't say much about yellow. So perhaps, I don't know if you want me to describe the yellow stage a little bit, characteristics of
yellow was the second last stage, right?
Yellow is the first stage that emerges after green as the first of the second tier stages. So, it's most importantly, yellow begins to see the process of development itself. It begins to see that we're developing, the world is developing, everybody's evolving. And so it begins to see that each previous stage, beige through green, has and will continue to play a critical role in the evolution of civilization and culture and self. So yellow sees that every stage has an important truth and that we have to honor that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, instead of feeling like everybody has to be more like me, it's sort of suddenly understanding that, because we have evolved through the stages, it also begins to see that there's emergence, that there's more to come, which is humbling. It's like we can actually not get arrogant and think, these people are at second tier, and I guess they're at the highest level of development. It's like, even that is just, like the food of tomorrow. There's more new stages to emerge, more new things to emerge. So we can, hopefully, we are humbler and practice more humility as we grow more. And it's also what's good about yellow is that it does more than see everybody's point of view, which is what green tries to do. Yellow can actually see and honor everybody's views, but also be willing to courageously and critically evaluate them. And so make some discriminating, discerning new decisions about how we operate technology or run organizations or run our own lives even. And it begins to see that separation of sort of dominator hierarchies versus natural or growth hierarchies is a really important development in yellow. And it's able to really, multiple perspectives is a beautiful term that is used in yellow. If you're talking about sort of, Hegel talked about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, Hegel's dialectic. And so, imagine if there's a way in which new technology in these social media platforms and such, for example, has algorithms that are able to see different people's thesis, antithesis, And can sort of AI, for example, generate a synthesis? So people begin to see the value of both the thesis and the antithesis. If it was able to like use it in the vast kind of the craziness that happened in the US around vaccinations, for example, and masking, and I think all sides have a truth. And instead of polarizing these views, could there be a new synthesis that is brought, that is, offered to us through a yellow stage way of understanding the world? Could that be the new way that organizations function, technology functions? Yeah.
Which actually leads me to the next topic. I think, we talked about climate, solving climate change as one applicable way, or one topic where you could use spiral dynamics to understand how. But I think one other topic it's interesting is polarization, where we're seeing. I mean, polarization is obviously a result of many different things. However, I do think that it's being enhanced by technology. So, for example, I mean, the algorithms know what you read, so they will send you more of what you read, and then your already biased view will just be enhanced by things you already read about. So that is one example where we're seeing technology in enhancing that. Like from a spiral dynamics point of view, like how could you explain polarization with spiral dynamics? And then if technology has, enhanced this, could also technology then be used to reverse it? So like,
yeah. I think first of all, well, let me just talk about, like, let's say like polarization, for example. How can spiral dynamics help us see how polarizing views exist?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So let's take, for example, a highly polarizing topic of, for example, immigration. Different value systems view immigration in through a very different value system. Green, for example, this kind of very egalitarian perspective might look at immigration as, these are people that are coming from oppressed nations, and they are experiencing a lot of poverty. And so we must help them. We must be sensitive to their needs and see what we can do to kind of integrate them into our society. And so immigration is, a huge topic in North America as well as Europe. And so Green views immigration in that egalitarian way, with some certain amount of sensitivity. Orange could look at immigration in more economical terms. For example, like, this could really boost our economy. It could be like cheap labor that can really boost our economy, perhaps, So Orange sees it in a very different way. Blue, the more ethnocentric groups of society, would see that immigration is, these people are coming to dilute our culture and destroy our culture even. They don't know how to integrate to our culture. Blue could see immigration as that which infiltrates our nation and our culture, and it takes our jobs. They're going to come and take our jobs. So this is how now you can see how Green, Orange, and Blue has very polarized views on the single topic of immigration, and you can bring it to any other highly polarizing issues around transgender issues, for example. Blue thinks that's just just a horrible thing, that you would think that you can create your own gender, or that's not how God created us. God created marriage to be between a man and a woman, and that's it. Like anything outside of that is terrible. And so these culture wars and most amount of polarization is really between Blue, Orange, and Green. Really mostly between Blue and Green, and Orange sort of sandwiched in the middle. And at least in sort of the United States. So that's one way that we can use a world like the teachings of something like a stage model like spiral dynamics to start to see what's going on.
Mm.
And I think that what technology then does
Mm.
typically with social media and these different bubbles, that is that it creates bubbles.
Yeah, filter
So like,
bubbles.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like creating these filter bubbles and these echo chambers where it's able to kind of follow our behaviors online,
Mm.
and then it's sort of manipulating our behavior to like stay on this page longer. And so
Yeah.
I'll keep feeding you more of what like enrages you to keep you engaged. So it can really drive engagement in all the
Mm.
wrong ways. And I think like there are systems and algorithms that could also see that if you're coming from a blue stage and then saying something like your views on conservative views are stupid, and so it'll feed the wrong information just to enrage you and keep you there for longer and longer. And I think that if technology can come more from a yellow perspective, it'll do something different. And
Mm.
I don't know how that can be done
Mm.
necessarily, but I think that people have been talking for a long time
Mm.
about these kinds of topics in the integral community, in the spiral dynamics
Mm.
community, around what would technology do if it was capable of changing. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Just pause there. I put it on airplane mode.
Sometimes that happens. Anyways, speaking of
Yeah,
technology.
there we go. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, again, I think it's really
Mm.
important, however, to remember that even something like spiral dynamics is really dangerous in the wrong hands.
Yeah.
So let's say, like, there's a whole bunch of technologists who learn spiral dynamics, and then they
Mm.
realize blue really likes this, or orange really likes this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Mm.
technology is primarily an orange worldview, an orange set of skills.
Mm.
So it's very good at manipulating all the other stages
Mm.
to make money, basically, right? To
Yeah.
make money out of it. So it'll just feed more blue stuff and make money out of that. And if it learns
Yeah.
that, ooh, like green really loves, uh, you know, yoga mats, we'll sell them yoga mats.
Yeah.
And blue really loves Bibles. Let's find a way to sell Bibles. So it's not challenging these systems,
Mm.
and I think that's what learning spiral dynamics is useful. It's because you can actually, maybe hopefully, if more people learn stage systems like that, you can find also where it's being misused.
Yeah. It's a good way to be humble about the approach of using it as well. It's sorry. Anyways, but I have been having one idea about like how to use technology. The question is more like how would it make sense commercially? But like having kind of like a bot that pops up and asks you questions did you know that this article mentions this X amount of time? So did you know that these people have linked to this? So did you know that just asking smart questions without judgment?
Yeah,
But I have no idea how it would work in practice, but I just had this
yeah,
yeah
yeah,
um,
yeah. I think eventually, the way technology has been used right now is that it's sort of like, the more connections in the sort of the current social
mm,
media area, the
mm,
more connections we have, the better. Like, and
yeah
I think that perhaps a yellow stage might at some point inject a different idea of perhaps no, actually fewer connections. Let's make our connections more meaningful. The current media, because it is mostly also coming from that orange and also green worldview. Green says everybody's welcome. Like everybody, like we're not going to dictate to you what is right and wrong, and you get to be who you are. And so it's in integral, we call it like a perspectival madness, because there's no truth. Postmodernity takes away any truth claims. So you can't say anything is good or bad. So it's like it's like the most common denominator belief system, everything goes. And I think that I think a yellow stage might bring a little bit more discrimination or discernment in a good way, where we can be in an intelligent community, but also randomize it so that we also get exposure to other stages or other worldviews. I like the concept of bubble hopping, right? Can technology create bubble hopping for us?
That is, that is a good teaser for any developer that's listening to this.
Yeah. I've actually heard of, I don't know where, I've heard this a while ago, a couple years ago even. I heard that there was a Google engineer who decided to create a program for himself where everything was randomized for a whole entire year. So he would just like randomly show up at like Facebook would show like events that are open to the public. So he would just like randomly end up in some event that he wasn't choosing. He wasn't going by what Facebook was suggesting in his feed. His feed was like completely, his social media experience in general was completely randomized. So he got to hang out with people he normally wouldn't and just learn a whole lot. So I think it's a polarity though. I think we need the polarity of randomizing, like decentralizing, but also centralizing, so that we actually do get to deepen our sense of where we belong and feel safe there, and also decentralize our experience in such a way that you are challenged to be in circumstances or learn information, or you're provided content that also challenges you and it's new and unfamiliar to you.
Yeah, I like that. It's balance and everything, right? But I think what we're seeing, I think the role of the editor is also a good example, where like now, if most people consume news through social media, or at least they see the link there and then they scroll further to read more at the news outlet, then it's like the algorithm has become your editor for what you will see. But the role of the editor for big magazines is to, at least, they're also biased, they're also humans, but at least their role is at least to try to bring in different perspectives and a good balance of minorities versus etc. But yeah, so that is it's like how do you find that balance again, I guess? Whereas it will never be perfect.
It won't be perfect, and nor should it be, actually, because I think that the world should always be challenged with struggles. Also just sort of speaking in terms of how like Nordic countries are, there's more of green perhaps in Nordic countries, for example. And I think that's good in a sense of there's less sort of fighting, perhaps more sort of, gross happiness, for example. But also in some ways it's less diversity. And on the long run, I wonder if places like the US or England even, where there is more diversity, like, like I said, 30% blue, 30% orange, 30% green, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think some of the struggles are what creates like the virtual engine, the sort of the driving to create more optimal fittedness through the struggle. Just the struggle of humanity actually causes people to wake up. So there's less sameness isn't necessarily a bad thing. So I think like sometimes things can look really peaceful because, well, there's like everybody's in a green bubble. It's not, it's okay to some degree. That's what I said. I think the polarity of sort of centralizing effect is good, but we also need the decentralizing. So we need the safety of our own bubble to some degree, but then also how can we have the other around? John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist, speaks about like the agent and the arena relationship. And he talks about sort of in cognitive science, the Darwinian theory as one of the first dynamical systems theories, where evolution really requires growth, development. Evolution really requires the polarity of an enabling constraint and a selective constraint. And he speaks about this as a virtual governor and a virtual generator. And I think these are things that technology can incorporate. And like the virtual governor is like the selective constraint that reduces our options, that blocks our experience in a certain way. The virtual generator is something that generates more possibility. And so a virtual governor is systematically together with a virtual generator is such that you're systematically regulating a feedback cycle. And this whole system is now called a virtual engine. And it's a dynamical systems theory where the virtual engine is generating your growth and also blocking your experience. And that the constraint and the optimization or the opening, enabling, they're both necessary. So I keep thinking, how can that be perhaps like a social media experience? That could be really interesting, where as an individual, maybe there are sort of AI algorithms that are able to assess where the user is coming from, encourage. And my friend Rolly was trying to, he knows a lot about AI. I don't, but he was trying to explain to me about how we're like in this situation where in a machine learning, we're like nodes in a machine learning problem where the system comes up with a goal. And then it's going to like make you behave a certain way to sell you something or to get you to do something online, right? And it's going to keep observing your behavior and keep modifying the input until you kind of do the behavior that it wants you to do. And the machine will find a way to like enrage you or like make you vote a certain way or make you buy something and keep you in the platform for a longer time. And looking at it through spiral dynamics, imagine if, so these algorithms are already there, right? They know our behavior. And so if we can shift the way that behavior is like changed, you can use those same algorithms to imagine if the AI program is able to detect that you're coming from an orange perspective constantly. What if it is able to like gently interject or inject that sense of the virtual governor, the sort of the selective constraints that are actually providing you a little bit of like baby perspectives from green. So just not constantly in orange. So yeah, I mean, I think that these are ways in which technology can be used in a really good way if there are ethical people. And that brings us to like,
a whole new topic.
Development.
Yeah.
Like imagine if every engineer at Google and Facebook and Twitter and if like Elon Musk can be taught spiral dynamics. Yeah.
Which actually brings me to my last question. So, I mean, you do this professionally as a coach and a facilitator. why should companies care about this? What's your elevator pitch?
Yeah. I mean, I can just speak to you in the sense of how do I use it in coaching and presentation and things like that. I think first of all, what it provides is compassion and kindness, really, hopefully. It's like once you see the differentiation, then you can see that once you see the different puzzle pieces, then it helps us to create a map of how we can begin the integration. And I think one of the most valuable things is that no one is wrong. That idea that no one is 100% wrong. This is something that I learned from Ken Wilber, which really allows for us to really see how can we emphasize the goodness of each stage and help integrate the sort of the stuck parts of each stage. And organizations can begin to have policies that create a win-win-win for each of the major stages. So imagine if like climate change, for example, the conversation of climate. In how can we create, and by the way, there is the Institute for Cultural Evolution. It's an organization that's based out of Boulder, Colorado. They're really writing policy documents that create this win-win-win solution for how technology is used, or how topics like immigration or abortion or the hot topic polarizing issues. The way to really try and create more conversation between these polarized stages is to see how can coming from a yellow stage, we create a win for red. So your sense of self-awareness and your sense of investment in yourself can be enhanced in a good way. For blue, how can we create a win for your traditional belief system so that you don't have to be threatened by science or threatened by this kind of woke or for orange, how can we create an economical success for you? And a science, give room for technological scientific advancement. For green, how can we create a win for you where you have, where you get to really see the value of sensitivity to the deep struggles of this world. So that we usually use the words, how can we create a win-win, like a win for me and a win for you. So in the spiral dynamics and the stage theory world, we say, how can we create a win-win-win, especially around the topic of polarization. Create a win for blue, traditional worldviews. Create a win for orange, the scientific, rational, technological view. Create a win for green, the postmodern, sensitive, pluralistic, relativist view. So you begin to really see the value of each of those stages as organizations if we know about these kinds of stage theories. And I think helping people be where they're at, to be able to actually see you're not wrong for being where you're at. A 7-year-old is not wrong for being a 7-year-old. As opposed, like a 7-year-old doesn't have to start behaving like a 12-year-old.
Yeah, no.
You're just as you are, but there can be underlying systems that are working to make the stage that you're at healthier.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining. It's been a great conversation. I think, I really like it. It's a humble way in approaching and visualizing and just, getting more understanding with one another. The win-win-win sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's all about sort of how we use and misuse these tools. So I would definitely say don't go by the little bits and pieces of what I said today. If someone's interested, definitely pick up a spiral dynamics book, take a course.
You should never stereotype, right? It's just another lens, right? But you can put on another lens.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maria, for having me your amazing podcast, and I wish you all the best as you talk about these important topics. And I think like technology really needs people like you.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you for saying that.
You are willing to really explore topics like human development and how it could impact and really make better the world of technology that is to some degree kind of scary and uncontrolled, and leaders like you in the world of technology will be what makes a difference, I think, to help us move up the spiral. Yeah, so thank you.
Kind words. Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And if you want to read up more about the guest, then you can go to the show notes to get all of the links. And also, if you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter to never miss the latest episode. Thank you for today. See you in the next episode.